The morning sun cast long shadows across Westminster Bridge as tourists gathered with cameras and excited chatter. Among them stood Harold Thompson, a 78-year-old man whose weathered hands gripped a simple walking cane. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, his posture remained straight and dignified. Harold had served in the British Army for 30 years, retiring as a sergeant major, but those days seemed like a distant memory now. Harold had come to London to visit his late wife's favorite spot near the Palace of Westminster. Margaret had always loved watching the changing of the guard ceremony, and every year on their anniversary, Harold made this pilgrimage alone. Today marked 5 years since her passing, and the familiar ache in his chest felt as heavy as ever. The crowd around him buzzed with excitement as the iconic red-uniformed guards marched in perfect formation. Children pointed eagerly while parents snapped photos. Harold found himself smiling slightly at their joy, remembering how Margaret used to clap her hands together like a delighted child during these ceremonies. Standing about 20 feet away, a different kind of observer watched the scene unfold. Marcus Tank Rivera, a 25-year-old with multiple tattoos covering his muscular arms, surveyed the crowd with predatory eyes. His reputation in the local underground scene was built on intimidation and quick cash grabs from unsuspecting tourists. Tank had noticed the elderly man standing alone, seemingly lost in thought, and immediately identified him as an easy target. Tank's criminal record stretched back to his teenage years, filled with petty theft, assault charges, and drug-related offenses. He had spent 3 years in prison and recently been released on probation. Despite warnings from his parole officer about staying clean, old habits died hard. The sight of Harold's expensive-looking watch and the bulge of what appeared to be a wallet in his jacket pocket proved too tempting to resist. The royal guards continued their ceremonial march, their bearskin hats towering above the crowd. The rhythmic sound of their boots on pavement created a hypnotic atmosphere that seemed to transport everyone present back in time. Harold closed his eyes briefly, letting the familiar sounds wash over him. He could almost hear Margaret's gentle voice commenting on the precision of the guards' movements. Tank began to move closer, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. His strategy was simple but effective. Bump into the target, create confusion, and grab whatever valuables he could before disappearing into the crowd. He had executed this plan dozens of times before, and elderly tourists were always the easiest marks. They were typically confused by the bustling environment and too polite to make a scene. As Tank approached, Harold remained focused on the ceremony, completely unaware of the danger closing in. The old veteran's mind wandered to memories of his own military service, when he had stood at attention during countless ceremonies just like this one. He remembered the pride he felt wearing the uniform, the brotherhood among soldiers, and the sense of purpose that had driven him through some of the most challenging moments of his life. The crowd pressed closer as the guards reached the peak of their performance. Tank saw his opportunity and made his move, deliberately bumping into Harold with enough force to knock the elderly man off balance. Harold stumbled, his cane clattering to the ground as he struggled to maintain his footing. "Watch where you're going, old man," Tank snarled, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. He wanted to create the impression that Harold was at fault, a common tactic that usually prevented witnesses from intervening. His hand shot out toward Harold's jacket pocket, fingers reaching for the wallet he had spotted earlier. But something unexpected happened. Instead of the confused, frightened reaction Tank anticipated, Harold's eyes sharpened with a clarity that seemed to cut through the chaos around them. Years of military training, though dormant, were never truly forgotten. Harold's body moved with surprising speed and precision, his hand catching Tank's wrist in a grip that was far stronger than anyone would expect from a man his age. "I don't think so, son," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made several nearby tourists turn their heads. Tank found himself frozen, caught off guard by the unexpected resistance. He had expected an easy victim, not someone who could fight back. The royal guards, though trained to maintain their ceremonial composure, were not oblivious to disturbances in their vicinity. 2 guards had noticed the commotion and were already moving to investigate, their training kicking in despite the formal nature of their current duty. Their presence added an immediate sense of authority to the scene that Tank had not anticipated. Tank tried to pull his arm free, but Harold's grip remained firm. The elderly veteran's eyes held a steeliness that spoke of battles fought and won. of a life spent protecting others. For the first time in years, Tank found himself facing someone who refused to be intimidated. "Let go of me, you crazy old fool," Tank hissed, his usual confidence beginning to crack. The situation was spiraling out of his control, and the approaching guards made him nervous. He had planned for a quick grab and escape, not a prolonged confrontation in front of dozens of witnesses. Harold maintained his grip while his free hand retrieved his fallen cane. The weight and balance of the walking stick felt familiar in his hand, reminding him of the ceremonial sword he had once carried during his own military ceremonies. His training may have been decades old, but muscle memory was a powerful thing. The crowd around them began to take notice of the altercation. Some tourists stepped back, unsure of what was happening, while others pulled out their phones to record the unexpected drama. The ceremonial atmosphere of the guard ceremony had shifted into something far more immediate and real. Tank's frustration mounted as he realized his usual intimidation tactics were failing spectacularly. This old man was not behaving like any victim he had encountered before. The criminal's mind raced as he tried to figure out how to salvage the situation without drawing even more attention from the authorities. Harold's military instincts were fully engaged now. He assessed the threat level, calculated his options, and prepared for whatever might come next. The peaceful memorial visit to honor his wife's memory had transformed into something that required the skills he had hoped never to use again. But as he looked into Tank's angry eyes, Harold knew that sometimes the past had a way of catching up with the present, and old soldiers never truly retired from the duty to protect others. Tank's face flushed red with embarrassment and rage as more tourists began to stare at the unfolding confrontation. His street reputation was built on fear and quick victories, not public humiliation at the hands of an elderly man. The criminal jerked his arm harder, trying to break free from Harold's surprisingly strong grip, but the veteran's hold remained steady. "I said let go," Tank shouted, drawing even more attention from the crowd. His voice carried across the courtyard, causing several families with young children to move away from the disturbance. The peaceful ceremony was quickly becoming overshadowed by the brewing conflict between the unlikely pair. Harold's expression remained calm and controlled, a stark contrast to Tank's growing agitation. Years of military discipline had taught him that losing his temper in a crisis only made situations worse. He studied Tank's face carefully, noting the desperation creeping into the younger man's eyes. Harold had seen that look before, during his service in conflict zones where frightened soldiers made dangerous decisions. The two royal guards who had noticed the disturbance were now moving with purpose through the crowd. Their ceremonial role required them to maintain order and protect civilians, and this situation clearly fell under their jurisdiction. Their red uniforms cut through the sea of tourists like ships navigating through choppy waters. Guard Corporal James Mitchell, a 28-year-old career soldier, led the approach. His partner, Lance Corporal Sarah Davies, followed closely behind. Both guards had served multiple tours in Afghanistan and were highly trained in conflict de-escalation. Despite their ceremonial duties today, they were fully prepared to handle real-world threats. Tank spotted the approaching guards and panic began to set in. His parole conditions strictly forbade any contact with law enforcement, and getting arrested now would mean an immediate return to prison. The simple robbery attempt was rapidly becoming his worst nightmare scenario. "This is your last warning, old man," Tank growled, his free hand moving toward his jacket pocket. Harold's experienced eyes immediately tracked the movement, recognizing the universal gesture of someone reaching for a weapon. The veteran's grip tightened on his walking cane as he prepared for the situation to escalate further. Harold had faced armed opponents before, though it had been many years since his last combat situation. During his military career, he had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, where split-second decisions often meant the difference between life and death. Those instincts, though rusty, were beginning to surface again. The crowd around them had grown larger as word of the confrontation spread through the gathered tourists. Some people were recording the incident with their phones, while others called out suggestions or warnings. A few elderly tourists seemed to recognize Harold as a fellow veteran, noting his posture and bearing despite his civilian clothes. Everyone stepped back. "Please," Corporal Mitchell called out as he approached, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His hand rested casually on his ceremonial sword. though both guards were also equipped with modern communication devices to call for additional backup if needed. Tank's eyes darted between Harold, the approaching guards, and the potential escape routes through the crowd. His criminal mind was calculating odds and options, but none of them looked favorable. The situation had gone from a simple mugging to a public incident with military personnel involved. Harold finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the immediate area. "This young man seems to have mistaken me for an easy target," he said, his tone measured and calm. "I believe he intended to relieve me of my belongings." The veteran's understated British manner of describing the attempted robbery drew surprised chuckles from some nearby tourists. "That's a lie," Tank shouted, his panic making him reckless. "This crazy old man grabbed me for no reason. I was just trying to get through the crowd." His story was obviously fabricated, and several witnesses who had seen the initial contact began shaking their heads and muttering disagreements. Lance Corporal Davies had positioned herself to block Tank's most obvious escape route while Corporal Mitchell continued his approach. Their teamwork was seamless, the result of countless hours of training together. They had dealt with everything from terrorist threats to drunk tourists, and this situation fell somewhere in between. Harold's grip on Tank's wrist remained firm, but he could feel the younger man's muscles tensing for what might be a desperate escape attempt. The veteran's military training kicked in fully as he analyzed the tactical situation. He was outnumbered by one, but had the advantage of position and the support of approaching authorities. Tank made his move suddenly, throwing his full weight backward while simultaneously reaching into his jacket with his free hand. Harold had anticipated this action and was ready for it. Instead of trying to hold on and risk being pulled off balance, the veteran smoothly released Tank's wrist while stepping forward and to the side. The sudden lack of resistance sent Tank stumbling backward, exactly as Harold had planned. The criminal's hand emerged from his jacket holding a small knife, its blade glinting in the morning sunlight. Gasps arose from the crowd as tourists realized how serious the situation had become. Harold's walking cane moved with practiced precision, the weighted head striking Tank's knife hand with enough force to send the weapon spinning away across the pavement. The move was executed with the kind of fluid efficiency that could only come from years of combat training. Even though those years were decades in the past, Tank cried out in pain and surprise as the knife flew from his numbed fingers. He cradled his injured hand against his chest while staring at Harold with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. This was definitely not the helpless elderly victim he had expected to encounter. The royal guards reached the scene just as the knife clattered to a stop near a group of stunned tourists. Corporal Mitchell immediately moved to secure the weapon, while Lance Corporal Davies positioned herself between Tank and any potential escape routes. Their professional competence was evident in every movement. "Sir, are you injured?" Corporal Mitchell asked Harold, though his eyes remained fixed on Tank, who was still nursing his bruised hand and looking increasingly desperate. The veteran shook his head calmly, his breathing barely elevated despite the physical confrontation. Tank's mind raced as he realized how thoroughly his simple robbery attempt had backfired. Not only had he failed to get any money, but now he was facing assault charges, weapons violations, and a certain return to prison. The elderly man he had targeted had somehow turned the tables completely, leaving Tank as the one in trouble instead. Tank's desperation reached a critical point as he found himself surrounded by witnesses, disarmed, and facing two approaching royal guards. His street instincts kicked in, and he decided that his only option was to fight his way out of the situation. Despite the pain in his knife hand, he was still younger, larger, and presumably stronger than the elderly man who had humiliated him. "You think you're tough, old man?" Tank snarled, raising his fists in a boxer's stance. His years in prison had taught him how to fight dirty, and he had never lost a physical confrontation with someone Harold's age. "Let's see how tough you really are without that stick." Harold calmly adjusted his grip on his walking cane, the weight of it feeling more familiar with each passing moment. His body automatically shifted into a defensive posture that he had not used in over 20 years, but muscle memory was proving to be remarkably reliable. The crowd around them formed a wider circle, sensing that the confrontation was about to escalate significantly. Tank charged forward with the reckless aggression of someone who had nothing left to lose. His right fist aimed straight for Harold's face, intending to end the fight with one decisive blow. But Harold was no longer the confused elderly tourist that Tank had initially targeted. The veteran had transformed into something much more dangerous. Harold sidestepped Tank's charge with surprising agility, using his cane to redirect the criminal's momentum rather than absorbing the impact directly. Years of military combat training had taught him that the key to defeating a larger, stronger opponent was to use their own force against them. Tank stumbled past Harold off balance and exposed. The veteran's counterattack was swift and precise. The weighted head of his walking cane struck Tank behind the knee, causing the criminal's leg to buckle. Tank crashed to the pavement hard, his hand scraping against the rough stone as he tried to break his fall. The crowd gasped at the speed and efficiency of Harold's response. Corporal Mitchell and Lance Corporal Davies moved to intervene, but Harold held up a hand to signal that he had the situation under control. The guards hesitated, recognizing the authority in Harold's gesture and the professional way he was handling the threat. Both military personnel could tell that Harold had extensive combat experience despite his civilian appearance. Tank rolled over and scrambled to his feet, his pride wounded more than his body. Blood trickled from his scraped palms and his jeans were torn at the knee where he had hit the ground. The criminal's face was flushed with humiliation and rage as he realized that his reputation would be destroyed if word got out about being beaten by a 78-year-old. "Man, I'm going to kill you for that," Tank growled, his voice filled with genuine menace. He reached down and picked up a loose piece of decorative stone from the courtyard, hefting it like a weapon. The threat level had escalated again, and several tourists screamed and moved further back from the confrontation. Harold's expression hardened as he assessed this new threat. A thrown stone could cause serious injury or death, especially to someone his age. The playful cat-and-mouse game had ended, and now the veteran was facing a genuinely dangerous situation that required a more decisive response. Tank reared back to throw the stone, but Harold was already moving. The veteran stepped forward instead of backward, closing the distance between them in a way that Tank had not expected. Harold's walking cane swept upward in a controlled arc, striking Tank's throwing arm just as he began his motion. The impact sent the stone flying harmlessly over the crowd, but the real damage was done to Tank's elbow joint. The criminal cried out in pain as his arm went numb from the precisely placed strike. Harold had targeted a nerve cluster that would temporarily disable Tank's arm without causing permanent damage, a technique he had learned during his military service. Tank staggered backward, clutching his useless arm and staring at Harold with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Nothing about this confrontation had gone according to plan, and he was beginning to realize that he had made a terrible mistake in targeting this particular elderly man. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, recognizing that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Many of the tourists were taking pictures and videos, capturing Harold's unexpected display of skill and courage. The elderly veteran had become an instant hero in the eyes of the gathered spectators. Corporal Mitchell stepped forward, his admiration for Harold evident in his expression. "Sir, that was expertly done," he said, his professional appreciation clear in his voice. "Where did you serve?" The question was asked with the respect that one soldier shows another, regardless of age or current circumstances. 30 years, British Army. Harold replied simply, his breathing still steady despite the physical exertion. Sergeant Major retired. The confirmation of his military background explained everything to the Royal Guards, who now understood why Harold had handled the situation with such professional competence. Tank was breathing heavily, his injured arm hanging uselessly at his side while his other hand pressed against his bruised ribs. The criminal's eyes darted around the crowd, looking for any possible escape route, but he was completely surrounded by witnesses and blocked by the two guards. Lance Corporal Davies was already speaking into her radio, calling for police backup and medical assistance. The situation had moved beyond what the ceremonial guards could handle alone, and proper law enforcement needed to take custody of Tank for the attempted robbery and assault charges. Harold straightened his jacket and retrieved his walking cane, checking it for any damage from the confrontation. The weapon had served him well, just as it had been designed to do by craftsmen who understood that a gentleman's walking stick might occasionally need to serve a more practical purpose. Tank slumped against a nearby wall, defeated and humiliated. His criminal career had just taken a devastating blow, and he knew that the video recordings of his failure would probably end up on social media within hours. The tough reputation he had spent years building was destroyed in less than 10 minutes by a man old enough to be his grandfather. The irony of the situation was not lost on the gathered crowd. They had come to watch a ceremonial display of British military tradition and had instead witnessed a real-life demonstration of military skill and courage. Harold Thompson, the quiet elderly widower who had come to honor his wife's memory, had unexpectedly become the star of the show. As sirens wailed in the distance announcing the arrival of London Metropolitan Police, Tank made one final desperate attempt to escape his predicament. Despite his injured arm and bruised ribs, the criminal pushed himself away from the wall and tried to bull rush through the crowd of tourists. His plan was simple: create enough chaos and confusion to slip away before the police arrived. Tank lowered his shoulder and charged toward a group of elderly tourists, hoping to scatter them and create an opening. But his desperation had made him sloppy, and he had forgotten about the two royal guards who were still very much in control of the situation. Lance Corporal Davies moved with lightning speed, positioning herself directly in Tank's path. The collision between Tank and the trained soldier was brief and decisive. Davies used Tank's own momentum against him, stepping aside at the last moment. While extending her leg to trip the charging criminal, Tank tumbled to the ground once again, this time landing face first on the stone courtyard with a sickening thud. Harold watched the scene unfold with professional interest, noting how the young guards handled themselves under pressure. Their training was evident in every movement, and he felt a surge of pride in the current generation of British military personnel. These young soldiers were upholding the same traditions and standards that had guided his own career decades earlier. Tank groaned and rolled over, blood now streaming from his nose where it had connected with the pavement. His escape attempt had only added more injuries to his growing collection, and his situation had become even more hopeless. The criminal lay on the ground, breathing heavily and finally accepting that his fate was sealed. The crowd of tourists had grown considerably larger as word of the confrontation spread throughout the area. People were pointing and taking pictures, many of them focused on Harold, who had somehow managed to maintain his dignified composure throughout the entire ordeal. The elderly veteran stood calmly with his walking cane, looking more like a distinguished gentleman than someone who had just defeated an armed attacker. 3 police officers arrived on the scene, their radios crackling with communications as they assessed the situation. The lead officer, Sergeant Rebecca Walsh, was a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police who had seen every type of incident imaginable. She approached Corporal Mitchell first, recognizing the need to get a clear picture of events from the military personnel who had witnessed everything. "What's the situation here?" Sergeant Walsh asked, pulling out her notebook to document the incident. Her eyes moved between Tank, who was still bleeding on the ground, and Harold, who appeared completely unruffled by the recent violence. "Corporal." Mitchell provided a concise summary of events, explaining how they had witnessed Tank's attempted robbery and Harold's remarkable self-defense. The guard's report was professional and thorough, covering all the key details that would be needed for the police investigation and subsequent criminal charges. Tank attempted to interrupt the conversation, trying to spin his own version of events. "This is all a misunderstanding," he wheezed, struggling to sit up despite his injuries. "That old man attacked me for no reason. I was just trying to ask for directions." His protests were immediately contradicted by a chorus of tourist witnesses who had recorded the entire incident on their phones. Several people stepped forward, eager to share their video evidence with the police. Tank's face fell as he realized that his lies would be easily disproven by multiple recordings from different angles. Harold approached Sergeant Walsh with the measured pace of someone accustomed to dealing with authority figures. "Officer, I'm Harold Thompson," he said, extending his hand in greeting. "I believe this young man intended to rob me, and when I resisted, he escalated to violence. I was forced to defend myself." The veteran's calm, articulate explanation stood in stark contrast to Tank's increasingly frantic denials. Sergeant Walsh could immediately tell which version of events was more credible, especially given the physical evidence and multiple witness accounts that supported Harold's story. Dr. Emily Chen, a paramedic who had arrived with the police, knelt down to examine Tank's injuries. His broken nose was obvious, but she was more concerned about potential head trauma from his repeated falls to the stone pavement. The criminal would need medical treatment before he could be properly booked into custody. Tank winced as Dr. Chen examined his injuries, his tough guy persona completely shattered by the morning's events. The criminal who had started the day planning a simple robbery was now facing assault charges, weapons violations, and a humiliating defeat that would follow him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Harold found himself surrounded by admiring tourists who wanted to thank him for standing up to the criminal. Many of them were elderly themselves and felt a special connection to the brave veteran who had refused to be victimized. Some were asking for selfies, treating Harold like a celebrity. "Excuse me, sir," said a well-dressed woman in her 60s, approaching Harold with her husband. "My name is Patricia Williams, and I just wanted to say how impressed we are with your courage. My husband served in the Royal Navy, and we both recognize skill when we see it." Harold accepted their thanks graciously, though he seemed somewhat uncomfortable with all the attention. He had never sought recognition for his military service, and he certainly had not expected to become a public figure because of this morning's events. All he had wanted was a quiet moment to remember his late wife. The police finished collecting statements from witnesses and reviewing the video evidence on various phones and cameras. The case against Tank was overwhelming, with multiple angles of footage showing his attempted robbery, his escalation to violence, and his repeated failures to overcome Harold's superior tactics. Sergeant Walsh approached Harold as the paramedics prepared to transport Tank to the hospital under police guard. "Mr. Thompson, we'll need you to come to the station later today to sign your formal statement," she said. "But I want you to know that you handled this situation perfectly. Your military training clearly served you well." Harold nodded and agreed to visit the police station later in the day. As Tank was loaded onto a stretcher and wheeled away, the criminal cast one final look at the elderly man who had ruined his life. The defeat in Tank's eyes was complete, and Harold felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness at how the morning had unfolded. The royal guards resumed their ceremonial duties as the crowd began to disperse, though many tourists lingered to get one more look at Harold. The ceremony continued, but it had been completely overshadowed by the real-life drama that had just concluded. Harold Thompson, the quiet widower who had come to honor his wife's memory, had inadvertently become the most interesting thing to happen at the changing of the guard in decades. 3 hours later, Harold sat in the witness interview room at New Scotland Yard, recounting the morning's events to Detective Inspector Thomas Bradford. The detective was a seasoned investigator who had handled thousands of cases, but he found himself genuinely impressed by the elderly veteran's precise recollection of every detail of the confrontation. "Mr. Thompson, in 30 years of police work, I've never seen a victim handle themselves quite like you did today," Detective Bradford said, reviewing the witness statements and video evidence spread across his desk. "Your military background clearly made the difference in what could have been a very dangerous situation." Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still not entirely comfortable with being treated like a hero. "I simply did what needed to be done, Detective. In my day, we were taught that you don't back down from bullies, regardless of your age." His modest response only reinforced the detective's respect for the unassuming veteran. The interview room door opened, and Chief Superintendent Margaret Foster entered with a warm smile. She was a distinguished woman in her 50s who had worked her way up through the ranks of the Metropolitan Police through exceptional competence and leadership. Harold rose respectfully as she approached. "Mr. Thompson, I wanted to personally thank you for your actions today," Chief Superintendent Foster said, shaking Harold's hand firmly. "Not only did you protect yourself, but your intervention likely prevented that criminal from targeting other vulnerable tourists. We've discovered that Tank Rivera has a pattern of attacking elderly visitors to London." Harold learned that Tank had been responsible for at least 12 similar robberies over the past 6 months, targeting elderly tourists near major landmarks throughout the city. Most of his previous victims had been too frightened or embarrassed to report the crimes, allowing Tank to operate with relative impunity until today. "The video footage of your encounter has already been viewed over 2 million times on social media," Detective Bradford informed Harold, showing him his phone screen. "You've become something of an internet sensation, I'm afraid. The media is calling you the Guardian Grandfather and the Royal Defender." Harold groaned softly at the ridiculous nicknames, though he was secretly pleased that his actions might inspire other elderly people to stand up for themselves. Throughout his military career, he had always believed that courage was contagious, and that one person's bravery could motivate others to find their own strength. Meanwhile, across the city at St. Thomas Hospital, Tank Rivera was receiving medical treatment under heavy police guard. His broken nose had been reset, his ribs were wrapped, and his various cuts and bruises were being treated by a medical team that showed little sympathy for his condition. Dr. James Morrison, the emergency room physician treating Tank, had seen many criminals over the years, but he was particularly disgusted by someone who preyed on elderly victims. "You picked the wrong target today," he told Tank while examining his injuries. "That gentleman was clearly a trained soldier, and you're lucky he showed restraint." Tank's public defender, Sarah Mitchell, arrived at the hospital to meet with her new client. She reviewed his extensive criminal record and the overwhelming evidence against him, including multiple video recordings that showed his attempted robbery and subsequent assault on Harold. The case was essentially impossible to defend. "Mr. Rivera, I have to be honest with you," Sarah said, sitting beside Tank's hospital bed. "The evidence against you is overwhelming, and your criminal history makes it unlikely that any judge will show leniency. You're looking at significant prison time, possibly 7 to 10 years given the weapons charge and your violation of parole." Tank stared at the ceiling, finally beginning to understand the full consequences of his actions. What had started as a simple grab for easy money had destroyed his freedom and his reputation. The humiliating videos of his defeat were spreading across the internet, making him a laughingstock rather than the feared criminal he had tried to be. Back at the police station, Harold was finishing his formal statement when his mobile phone began ringing constantly. News organizations from around the world were somehow getting his contact information and requesting interviews about his dramatic confrontation with Tank. The veteran was overwhelmed by the sudden attention and had no idea how to handle media requests. "Mr. Thompson, if I may offer some advice," Chief Superintendent Foster suggested, "you might want to consider doing one formal interview with a reputable news organization. That way you can tell your story properly and perhaps discourage others from harassing you for quotes." Harold considered her suggestion carefully. He was a private man who valued his quiet retirement, but he also recognized that his story might inspire other elderly people to be more confident and assertive when faced with criminals. Perhaps some good could come from all this unwanted attention. Detective Bradford handed Harold a business card from BBC News, explaining that they had specifically requested an interview and had a reputation for treating their subjects with dignity and respect. "They've promised to focus on your military background and the importance of standing up to crime," he explained. Harold agreed to consider the interview request, though he insisted that any media attention should focus on the broader issues of crime against the elderly, rather than treating him as some kind of celebrity. His humility and focus on helping others only increased the respect that the police officers felt for him. As the afternoon wore on, Harold's story continued to spread across social media platforms and news websites. Veterans organizations were sharing the video with pride, while self-defense instructors were using it as an example of how proper training could be effective, regardless of age. The incident had touched a nerve with people who were tired of seeing criminals target vulnerable members of society. Harold's daughter, Susan, called him from her home in Scotland after seeing the news coverage. She was worried about her father's safety but also incredibly proud of his actions. "Dad, I knew you still had some fight left in you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Mom would have been so proud to see you standing up for yourself like that." The mention of his late wife brought tears to Harold's eyes. Margaret had always been his biggest supporter during his military career, and she had encouraged him to stay strong and confident even in retirement. In a strange way, the morning's events felt like a tribute to her memory and the values they had shared together. By evening, Harold had received messages of support from former military colleagues, neighbors, and complete strangers who had been inspired by his story. The quiet widower who had started the day simply wanting to honor his wife's memory had accidentally become a symbol of courage and resilience for people around the world. Tank Rivera, meanwhile, was being transferred from the hospital to a holding cell where he would await his court appearance. His brief moment of internet fame was as a cautionary tale about underestimating people based on their age or appearance. The criminal who had thought he was picking an easy target had instead encountered a force he was completely unprepared to handle. 2 weeks after the confrontation that made him famous, Harold Thompson found himself sitting in the comfortable studio of BBC News, preparing for his first and only television interview. The veteran had spent the intervening time dealing with constant media requests, social media attention, and an overwhelming amount of correspondence from well-wishers around the world. Journalist Emma Richardson, a respected interviewer known for her thoughtful approach to human interest stories, sat across from Harold as the camera crew made their final preparations. She had been personally moved by Harold's story and was determined to present it with the dignity and respect it deserved. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for agreeing to speak with us today," Emma began as the cameras started rolling. "2 weeks ago, you became an internet sensation for defending yourself against a would-be robber. But I understand this incident was particularly meaningful because of where it took place and why you were there." Harold adjusted his tie nervously before responding. He had dressed in his best suit for the interview, and despite his discomfort with being on television, he maintained the dignified bearing that had impressed everyone who had met him. "Yes, that's correct. I visit that location every year on my wedding anniversary. My late wife, Margaret, loved watching the changing of the guard ceremony." The interview continued for 30 minutes, with Harold sharing details about his military service, his life with Margaret, and his thoughts on crime against elderly people in modern society. Emma skillfully guided the conversation to highlight Harold's humility and the deeper meaning behind his actions. "What would you say to other elderly people who might find themselves in similar situations?" Emma asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. Harold paused thoughtfully before answering. "I would tell them that age doesn't have to mean helplessness. We've lived through wars, raised families, and overcome countless challenges. We shouldn't let criminals think we're easy targets just because we have gray hair. But more importantly, I'd say that confidence and awareness are your best weapons, not necessarily physical confrontation." The interview struck a chord with viewers across the United Kingdom and beyond. Within hours of its broadcast, social media was flooded with messages of support and admiration for Harold's wisdom and courage. Veterans organizations reported increased membership inquiries, and self-defense classes for seniors saw a surge in enrollment. Meanwhile, Tank Rivera's legal troubles were mounting exponentially. His court-appointed lawyer had delivered the grim news that prosecutors were seeking the maximum sentence due to his extensive criminal record and the high-profile nature of his latest crime. The video evidence was so overwhelming that pleading guilty was his only realistic option. Tank sat in his prison cell, watching Harold's BBC interview on the small television mounted to the wall. The criminal who had thought he was targeting a helpless elderly man was forced to listen as Harold spoke eloquently about courage, dignity, and the importance of standing up to bullies. The irony was not lost on Tank that his victim had become a respected public figure, while he faced years behind bars. The prison guard, Officer Kevin Murphy, noticed Tank watching the interview with obvious discomfort. "That's the old man who handed you your backside, isn't it?" Murphy said with obvious amusement. "I heard the other inmates have been giving you grief about getting beaten up by a grandfather. Probably should have picked a different target, mate." Tank's humiliation was complete when fellow prisoners began calling him Grandpa's boy and making jokes about his spectacular failure. His reputation as a tough criminal was permanently destroyed, replaced by mockery and disrespect from the very people whose approval he had once craved. Back in Harold's modest London flat, the veteran was overwhelmed by the volume of mail and packages he was receiving from admirers around the world. Letters came from fellow veterans sharing their own stories, from elderly people thanking him for inspiring them to be more confident, and from young people expressing their admiration for his courage. One letter particularly moved Harold. It came from Mrs. Dorothy Chen, an 82-year-old widow from Manchester who had been too afraid to leave her house alone after being mugged 6 months earlier. She wrote that watching Harold's story had given her the courage to start going out again, and she had even enrolled in a senior self-defense class. Harold's daughter Susan visited him that weekend, bringing his grandchildren to see their famous grandfather. 8-year-old Tommy was particularly excited to meet his hero grandfather, having seen the video of the confrontation shared by his school friends. "Grandpa, did you really beat up a bad guy with your walking stick?" Tommy asked with wide-eyed wonder. Harold chuckled and knelt down to his grandson's level, his expression becoming serious but warm. "I didn't beat him up, Tommy. I protected myself when someone tried to hurt me. The important thing to remember is that we only use our strength to defend ourselves or protect others who can't protect themselves." We never start fights, but we finish them if we have to. The conversation with his grandson reminded Harold of the broader responsibility that came with his unexpected fame. Children around the world were looking up to him as a role model, and he felt obligated to use his platform to promote positive values rather than violence. 3 weeks after the incident, Harold received an unexpected visitor at his flat. Corporal James Mitchell, one of the royal guards who had witnessed the confrontation, appeared at his door in civilian clothes, carrying a carefully wrapped package. "Mr. Thompson, I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Corporal Mitchell said respectfully. "The regiment wanted to present you with something to show our appreciation for your actions that day. You represented the finest traditions of British military service." Inside the package was a beautifully crafted ceremonial walking stick, engraved with the insignia of the Household Division, and a brass plate reading, "Presented to Harold Thompson, Sergeant Major, retired, in recognition of courage and service above and beyond." Harold was deeply moved by the gesture from the younger generation of soldiers. The walking stick would become Harold's most treasured possession, replacing the ordinary cane that had served him so well during the confrontation. It was a tangible reminder that his actions had been recognized and respected by his military peers, something that meant more to him than all the media attention combined. As the weeks passed, Harold gradually adjusted to his new status as a minor celebrity. He used his platform wisely, speaking at veterans events and senior centers about confidence, preparedness, and the importance of not allowing criminals to intimidate law-abiding citizens. His message was always measured and responsible, emphasizing awareness and confidence over aggression. Tank Rivera was eventually sentenced to 8 years in prison, with the judge specifically citing the video evidence of his attack on Harold as proof of his violent tendencies and disregard for vulnerable members of society. The criminal, who had thought he was picking an easy target, had instead sealed his own fate and given Harold a platform to inspire millions of people around the world. 6 months after the incident that changed his life, Harold Thompson stood once again near Westminster Bridge, but this time he was not alone. The London Metropolitan Police had invited him to participate in a new community safety initiative, specifically designed to protect elderly tourists and residents from street crime. The program, dubbed Guardian London, paired experienced volunteers with police officers to patrol tourist areas and provide assistance to vulnerable visitors. Harold had reluctantly agreed to serve as the program's first volunteer coordinator, though he insisted that the focus should be on prevention and awareness rather than confrontation. "The goal is never to escalate situations," Harold explained to a group of 20 senior volunteers during their training session in a community center near Buckingham Palace. "We're here to be visible, to provide assistance, and to call for proper authorities when needed. Our presence alone will deter most criminal activity." Among the volunteers was Mrs. Dorothy Chen, the elderly widow from Manchester who had written to Harold months earlier. She had moved to London to be closer to her daughter and had specifically requested to join the Guardian London program after Harold's story had inspired her to reclaim her confidence. "Mr. Thompson, I never thought I'd have the courage to walk these streets again, let alone volunteer to help protect others," Dorothy said during a break in the training. "But watching you stand up to that, criminals showed me that we don't have to be victims just because we're older." Harold was deeply moved by Dorothy's transformation and the stories of other volunteers who had been inspired by his actions. The incident that had started as a simple attempted robbery had evolved into something much larger, a movement of elderly people refusing to be intimidated by criminals. Detective Inspector Thomas Bradford, who had investigated Harold's case, served as the police liaison for the Guardian London program. He was impressed by the enthusiasm and dedication of the senior volunteers, many of whom brought decades of life experience and professional skills to their new roles. "These volunteers have something that younger people often lack," Bradford explained to Harold as they watched the training session. "They have patience, wisdom, and the confidence that comes from having lived through difficult times. Criminals typically target elderly people because they assume they're helpless, but this program is changing that perception." The Guardian London program launched on a sunny Tuesday morning, with Harold and his team of volunteers taking their positions near major tourist attractions throughout central London. They wore distinctive blue vests with Guardian London Volunteer printed clearly on the front and back, making them easily identifiable to both tourists and potential criminals. Harold's assigned area was, appropriately, the stretch of road near Westminster Bridge, where his confrontation with Tank Rivera had taken place. As he walked his patrol route with Police Constable Sarah Jenkins, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that fateful morning 6 months earlier. The impact of the Guardian London program was almost immediate. Tourist crime in the covered areas dropped by nearly 40% in the first month of operation, and several potential criminals were deterred simply by the visible presence of the volunteer patrols. The program received praise from tourism organizations and was being studied by other cities considering similar initiatives. Tank Rivera, meanwhile, was serving his 8-year sentence at HMP Pentonville, where he had become something of a cautionary tale among the prison population. Other inmates regularly reminded him of his humiliating defeat at the hands of an elderly man, and his reputation as a tough criminal had been permanently destroyed. The prison's rehabilitation program required Tank to participate in anger management classes and vocational training, but his attitude remained sullen and resentful. He blamed Harold for ruining his life, refusing to accept responsibility for his own criminal choices that had led to his downfall. Tank's cellmate, Marcus Webb, was a career criminal serving time for burglary who had initially mocked Tank's story but gradually began to see it differently. "You know what your problem was," Marcus told Tank one evening as they sat in their shared cell. "You thought age made someone weak, but you were wrong. That old soldier had more real strength than you ever did." The comment stung because Tank knew it was true. Harold Thompson possessed qualities that Tank had never developed: discipline, courage, honor, and the respect of others. The criminal who had thought he was preying on weakness had instead encountered genuine strength and had been found wanting. Back in London, Harold's story continued to inspire people around the world. The Guardian London program had been featured in international media, and similar programs were being established in New York, Sydney, and Toronto. Harold received regular invitations to speak at conferences and events, though he remained selective about his appearances. One invitation that Harold could not refuse came from the Royal British Legion, the UK's leading veterans charity. They asked him to speak at their annual conference about the importance of veterans staying active and engaged in their communities after military service. Service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Harold told the audience of several hundred veterans and their families, "We have skills, experience, and wisdom that our communities need. Whether it's volunteering with programs like Guardian London or simply being good neighbors, we can continue to make a difference." The speech was met with a standing ovation, and several veterans approached Harold afterward to express their gratitude for inspiring them to become more involved in community service. Harold was pleased to see that his message was resonating with his fellow veterans. As the first anniversary of his confrontation with Tank Rivera approached, Harold decided to spend the day quietly at Margaret's grave in Highgate Cemetery. He wanted to tell his late wife about everything that had happened and to reflect on how their shared values had guided him through an unexpected chapter of his life. "I think you would have been proud, my dear," Harold said softly as he placed fresh flowers on Margaret's headstone. "I stood up for what was right, just like you always taught me to do, and somehow it's helped other people find their own courage." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak tree that shaded Margaret's grave, and Harold chose to interpret it as his wife's approval. He had never sought fame or recognition, but he was grateful that his actions had inspired others to stand up for themselves and help protect their communities. Harold Thompson had started that fateful morning as a quiet widower, visiting his wife's favorite place to watch a ceremony. He had ended it as an unlikely hero whose story would inspire countless others to find their own courage in the face of adversity. Sometimes, he reflected, the most ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things, and the measure of their character is determined by how they respond to that call.